Hello. The title of this lecture is National Government. After the American Revolution, it became clear who were the winners and losers. The future looked poorly for Loyalists, Indians, and Black slaves. Just about everyone else could see encouraging signs of a good life. The end of mercantilism promised better economic conditions in the long term. However, there were some unanswered questions on politics. Americans were unsure of their political direction, particularly at the national level. With their common enemy defeated, that is the British, American leaders from north to south quickly lost their unity of purpose and direction. Things were a little better at the state level. State governments made progress by drafting new constitutions that reflected small r Republican values. There was more power put in the hands of legislatures rather than in the hands of governors. Working things out at the national level was more complicated. Americans struggled to balance the power of government with their understanding of republicanism and individual liberty. The Treaty of Paris was not good for the Loyalists. The British did not negotiate hard for the Loyalists who had lost their property. There was no clear statements, only a recommendation for the restoration of confiscated property. Thus, the Loyalists were at the mercy of individual states. But the states did not repay the Loyalists for their losses. Of the total number of Loyalists, most remained in the United States, but many of them from the South actually left the region and settled in northern states or across the Appalachians. However, almost 100,000 Loyalists left America, with the majority going to Canada. Native Americans experienced considerable hardships in the years following the war. Most of the Indian tribes during the war had sided with the British, who abandoned them at the Treaty of Paris. The victorious Americans interpret the treaty as giving them the right of conquest. Indians west of the Appalachians were now without the Quebec Act to keep the Americans contained. The Indians were on their own as the frontier line pushed westward. Blacks gained little or nothing from the American Revolution. After the war, some Black Loyalists found their way to Nova Scotia. Some states, like Massachusetts, ruled against slavery. But after the war, Southern plantation owners expanded slavery to restore their fortunes. Slave owners seeking opportunity in the West took their slaves with them, thus spreading slavery. To keep pace with the expansion of the South, European and other slave traders brought almost 100,000 African slaves to America in the 20 years following the American Revolution. Sadly, George Washington made no public stand against slavery. During the war, the Continental Congress had exercised governmental powers by common consent, but without any constitutional sanction. George Washington had to wage a bitter and protracted war against Britain with only the support of the state governments as they chose to give. Near the end of the war, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union took effect after ratification by the states. But the articles were too weak for the effective management of the war. Americans believed that a national government that was any stronger would threaten their hard-won liberties. Congress had limited power or authority to carry out the necessary tasks of government, such as levying taxes and regulating commerce. The Articles of Confederation created little more than a league of friendship. There was no president. As for taxes, Congress had to petition the states, and each state retained its sovereignty and independence. Each state had one vote in Congress, and 9 votes were required to pass any measure. Could such a government last? One test was Daniel Shay's rebellion of 1786-87 that took place in Massachusetts when angry farmers protested high taxes and low farm prices. The perceived anarchy of Shay's rebellions frightened many people. A weak Congress could not continue. In 1787, delegates met to revise the articles, and actually they ended up creating an entirely new constitution. In time, all the states ratified the Constitution. James Madison was the key architect. Madison and the other founding fathers sought to check power with power and, quote, devise institutions that could somehow constrain the inevitable sinfulness of individuals and challenge some of it on behalf of the public good. The objective was balance. The government was divided into 3 branches: the executive, the legislative, and judicial. The executive included a president who could veto acts of Congress, vice president, and a cabinet that consisted of a secretary of state, secretary of treasury, a secretary of war, and attorney general. There were 2 houses: the Senate, where each state had equal representation, that is 2 per state, so 2 senators per state, and the House of Representatives, which was determined by state population. Now, where they met a problem with was how would they count the population in the South where there was a significant number of enslaved Blacks. So for the sensitive issue of defining population, slaves in the South were counted as 3/5 of a person. So every 5 slaves would count as 3 people for taxation and representation purposes. The judicial was represented by a Supreme Court and implied the right of judicial review. Although the government was set up with a system of checks and balances, it had enough authority to levy taxes, borrow money, regulate domestic and foreign commerce, conduct foreign relations, and maintain an army and navy. Now, the Constitution had to go through a process of ratification, and it began in Delaware on December 7th in 1787, and they had to reach 9 ratifications, nine states before the Constitution became legal, which was the case on June 21st, 1788. The Constitution became legal. What followed were the 4 additional states, and it all wrapped up on May 29th, 1790, the last state being Rhode Island. It was obvious that the Federalists and Republicans, 2 opposing groups, had different understandings of government. Not to be confused with the Republican Party that began decades later, Republicans of this time period were wary of a powerful national government. The leading Republican was Thomas Jefferson. Now, as for the Federalist approach emphasized the virtues of a strong central government. Making the case for the Constitution, the Federalist Papers were articles written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Published in local newspapers, the brilliant essays persuaded many people that the new Constitution was the best approach for the nation. The new Congress opened in 1784 with George Washington as president and John Adams as vice president. One of the first items for business was the Bill of Rights. By 1791, the first 10 amendments became effective. You have protections were provided, such as freedom of religion, speech, and the press, the right to bear arms and be tried by a jury. One of the most brilliant of the founding fathers was Alexander Hamilton, who was the key figure in the new government. As Treasury Secretary, Hamilton had an important job given the precarious state of government revenue. He sought a sound credit rating and argued that the federal government had to assume the debts incurred by the states during the war. Yes, the national debt would be extremely high, but he believed that a national debt was a national blessing, a kind of cement of union. To pay for the interest payments, the government turned to protective tariffs and taxes such as the excise tax on whiskey. In addition, Hamilton argued for a national bank, a powerful private institution of which the government would be the major stockholder and in which the federal treasury would deposit its surplus monies. The bank sought to establish a sound and stable national currency. Hamilton and Jefferson had opposing views concerning a national bank. Jefferson held that a national bank was not constitutional. He generally believed that what the Constitution did not permit, it forbade. Hamilton held that what the Constitution did not forbid, it permitted. He turned to the clause of the Constitution which stipulated that Congress may pass any laws, quote, necessary and proper to carry out the powers vested in the various government agencies. Hamilton won, and the Bank of the United States was created in 1791. Hamilton championed manufacturing in the rising market economy, but his opponents argued that he had little understanding of rural and frontier people. There were anti-tax protests in the early 1790s, notably the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, that signified the outrage felt by frontier people. According to them, Hamilton's excise tax on alcohol was a scheme to pick the pockets of the poor to enrich privileged speculators. Violence broke out in Pennsylvania, where vigilantes terrorized revenue collectors. Troops were sent in to quell the rebellion. Relatively speaking, the rebellion had been rather tame, but the episode did demonstrate the anger that some Americans had for the Federalist approach to running the nation. Indeed, the new government was was not born without opposition on several issues. There were opponents who believed that liberty was possible in a small republic in which the rulers were closely checked by the ruled. As they understood it, a strong national government would be distant from the people and would use its powers to override the states. These opponents to the new government wanted most of the powers of government kept firmly in the hands of state legislatures and state courts. In the eyes of most of the founding fathers, organized parties were menacing. Although the Constitution made no allowances for the development of political parties, opposition to the policies of the Federalists did see the emergence of the Republicans, later morphing as Democratic Republican. The Republicans believed that a nation of strong, independent yeomen farmers represented an ideal republic. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had a dim view of artisans, journeymen, and laborers who represented the mobs in the cities where vices thrived. The Jeffersonian view opposed the development of extensive manufacturing and industry. This would lead to, they argue, the growth of cities with malcontent, propertyless workers. This is not what they saw as ideal. Signs of strong opposition to the Federalists was apparent throughout the 1790s. In the election of 1796, Washington, who had offered a stable presence among the Federalists, was against running for president again. The nomination went to the vice president, went to James Adams rather than Alexander Hamilton. Well, both Adams and Hamilton were impressive, but why not Hamilton? A lawyer, his elitist and forceful approach turned people off. With Adams at the helm, the Federalists did increase their power 2 years later. Much of this power came due to conflict with France and a wave of patriotic war fever. But legislation such as the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 created much controversy. And these were bills that were passed by the Federalists and approved, signed by Adams. And these were looked upon as being rather partisan by the Republicans. The Republicans were not happy with this legislation. So again, you have much controversy. Because clearly the Alien and Sedition Acts limited freedom of speech and the press and the liberty of aliens. Foreigners had to reside in the country for 14 rather than 5 years before they could consider to be citizens. The president was also empowered to expel dangerous aliens at his discretion. The Sedition Act stated that it was a crime to be involved with any combination or conspiracy against legal measures of the government, including interference with federal officers and insurrections or riots. The law even prohibited writing, publishing, or speaking anything of a false, scandalous, and malicious nature against the government or any of its officers. In the eyes of the Republican, such legislation was partisan and was meant to punish those who opposed the Federalists. Strong political emotions escalated. One historian claims that the campaign of 1800 was, quote, probably the ugliest in American history. As it turns out, the results of the election were unclear. Yes, the Federalists lost, but the two presidential Republican candidates, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, received the same number of votes. The House of Representatives would decide, and at this point, it was under the control of the Federalists. So the House voted for the lesser of two evils. Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, became the new president. Now, turning to the issue of foreign relations, one can see that the response of other nations to the United States was mixed. In the 1770s, the Confederation Congress was not taken too seriously by other nation states. Consequently, there were failures with foreign affairs issues. After independence was won in 1783, foreign leaders saw the United States as consisting of 13 separate entities rather than a truly united nation. European rulers were cautious. In fact, the American experiment in democracy concerned some European rulers who feared a dangerous precedent being set. As for the British, they were still smarting from the whole revolutionary episode. When John Adams was sent to England in 1785, the London Public Advertiser wrote, quote, "An ambassador from America? Good heavens, what a sound." The Gazette surely never announced anything so extraordinary before, end of quote. The Americans were treated coldly by the British. The Americans desired a commercial treaty with the British, but to no avail. The British felt that the Americans had failed to honor certain articles of the peace treaty of 1783. And certainly they made a good point there, because that indeed was the case. I mean, for one, Congress did not execute orders for loyalist claims. The Americans had their own complaints. British armies departed with 3,000 black slaves, and the British remained at military and trading posts located within American territory, and we're talking mostly in the Great Lakes region. American relations with Spain were no better. Spain believed that America threatened their possessions in North America. And when one looks at a map of the 1790s, one can see how much of what would be present-day United States had been claimed by Spain. Spain disputed America's southwestern boundary at the 31st parallel. The Spanish also closed the Mississippi outlet in 1784 to American shipping, which had grave consequences to the pioneers moving to today's Tennessee and Kentucky. Secretary John Jay and the Spanish envoy attempted to settle, but no negotiations went nowhere. Congress allowed Jay to sacrifice the free navigation of the Mississippi in return for a commercial treaty with Spain. Still, the negotiations eventually fell apart as a result of Western protests. Tensions eased some in 1788 when Spain granted Americans passageway on the Mississippi, subject to the payment of duties, of course. American relations with France were complex. France had been America's main ally during the War of Independence, but France was suspicious of American power, and thus the French made only modest concessions when it came to the negotiations. For example, the Americans were permitted to trade with a few ports in the French West Indies. Losing the British shield, experiencing revenue problems, and operating under the toothless Articles of Confederation, the American government, that is the early American government, was in a feeble state. Others took advantage of a weak United States. For example, American shippers in the Mediterranean were at the mercy of Barbary pirates. And these pirates would target American vessels. Fortunately, the new Constitution ushered in a more promising era with the national government having greater power. President Washington, the Secretary of Treasury Hamilton, the Secretary of State Jefferson were men of impressive abilities. However, as was the case with domestic issues, there was tension between the Anglophile Hamilton and the French-loving Jefferson. The first foreign relations test involved a dispute between Britain and Spain over Nootka Sound on the West Coast. With the possibility of war between Spain and Britain, Americans feared that the British might seek permission to cross American territory to attack Spanish soil. This would jeopardize Spanish and American relations. Fortunately, Spain conceded Nootka and war did not occur, and the American government was released from a potentially divisive, if not bloody, issue. By 1791, America was important enough that the British sent an envoy to the United States. During these years, the French Revolution caused tension in America. The Hamiltonian Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans differed greatly on the French Revolution. When France declared war on Britain in early 1793, the Hamiltonians wanted to side with the British, whereas the Jeffersonians were sympathetic to the French revolutionaries. Within a few weeks, Washington issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, but American-British relations were poor. One sore point was that American pioneers in the Ohio region were attacked by natives using British weapons. Another serious issue was the British attack and detention of American ships carrying goods for a French colony. In the West Indies, the British seized approximately 300 American ships. The Americans responded by imposing a 1-month embargo on all shipping in American harbors bound for foreign ports, an action supported by the Jeffersonians, who wanted to suspend all commerce with the British. In 1794, John Jay signed a treaty with the British that opened commercial relations with the British Isles. But the treaty was viewed as a disaster by many American leaders, and it was barely approved by the Senate. The vote was 24 and 10 against. And yet it led to peaceful relations with the British and financial stability. Another positive consequence of Jay's treaty was the change of attitude of Spain. The Spanish wanted to have better relations with America and thus one less enemy. In a 1795 treaty, Spain allowed the free navigation of the Mississippi River and accepted the 31st parallel boundary. The treaty did much to quiet the discontent of Americans on the frontier. Now, Jay's treaty, it's a different story with France. The French were offended. Over a one-year period in 1796 and 1797, the French captured 316 vessels, although the English, the British, were also very destructive. President Adams sent Charles Pinckney, Eldridge Gerry, and John Marshall to negotiate with the French. But the French remained cool. In fact, the French Directory, and what I'm speaking about here is the period before the rise of Napoleon, the French Directory would only open official negotiations with the three Americans if the United States made apologies and pay some money, in essence, a bribe of 1.2 million liras. The incident became known as the X, Y, and Z affair. X, Y, and Z representing the French go-betweens. That is the individuals that were a part of the negotiations on the side of France. Pinckney and Marshall left France in disgust. The rise of anti-French emotions in America resulted in the suspension of commercial relations with France and the declaration that the two treaties of 1778 were void. That is, those treaties going back at the time when the Americans were seeking French support during the War of Independence. And those treaties were the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Franco-American Treaty of Alliance. Well, the Hamiltonian Federalists itched for war. And there was a war, but actually it was an undeclared war. And it lasted about 2.5 years and was confined to the sea, to the ocean. In September 1800, France canceled the 1778 treaties in exchange for the dropping of American financial claims. So in essence, what we have here is that, cooler heads had prevailed. To sum up, it took time for the United States to find its way after the War of Independence. Most Americans were optimistic, but there were those less enthusiastic. For example, in 1788, the anti-federalist Richard Henry Lee declared, quote, "'Tis really astonishing that the same people who have just emerged from a long and cruel war in defense of liberty should now agree to fix an elective despotism upon themselves and their posterity." End of quote. Attempting to have a strong and effective national government that did not compromise the liberty of individuals and even the powers of the states was not an easy task. The conflicting visions of republicanism, small r republicanism, and federalism shadowed the search for a representative democracy worthy of the sacrifices of the past. Thank you.